Paris in 1924, but it also had a number of adherents and practitioners and followers in other parts of the world. So I'm going to trace an alternative trajectory of surrealism that finds its way into certain pockets of activity in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere. Now the talk will begin by mentioning that a rather exciting and interesting exhibition was held in 2010 at the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo. In 2010, that gallery invited photographers Adam Broomberg and Oliver Chenerine to create an exhibition for the gallery's ground floor space in downtown Cairo. The Townhouse Gallery is probably the best known gallery in Cairo. It has an international standing and credibility and following, and the photographers are also very well known. And their work interrogates the conditions of photographic image making, usually in a documentary mode. In the course of their preparation for their project and their visit to Cairo, they read a book, they did extensive research actually, and they read a book about photography in Egypt by a woman named Maria Golia. In it, they discovered that at the end of the 30s in Egypt, a politicized artistic movement had emerged that dedicated itself to circumventing oppression using the techniques of surrealism. The group called itself the Art and Freedom Group, Al-Fan al-Hurriya. But they wondered why the surveys of surrealism as an international phenomenon rarely mentioned Egypt as a location for surrealist activity. Now I'm going to show you what they did to try to bring this Egyptian surrealist strand back into the language of art history and in the contemporary mindset of the art world. But first I want to quickly talk about what is surrealism and what were these Egyptian surrealists. So of course, some of the more famous adherents and practitioners and originators of surrealism are André Breton and René Magritte. This is a movement that came out of Dada and its focus on nonsense in the interwar period, and the sense that the Western world was undergoing a deep crisis and that traditional approaches to image making and representation could not hold in the new conditions. So issuing the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, artists involved in surrealism called for a revision of values, of cultural values at all levels. They were inspired by Freud and his psychoanalytical method. They were interested in the unconscious, and they were also inspired by the political ideology of Marxism. In terms of the strategies that they pursued, one of the chief ones was automatism, which was the idea that one should sort of issue forth from the contents of one's own mind imagery and language that was unimpeded and uncorrected by logic, rationalism, and social mores. So here in an illustrative image of a kind of surrealist production, you'll notice that it's actually the cover for a journal. You see artists who are surrealists with their eyes closed as if they are conjuring from their own unconscious this kind of imagery, and then in the center you have the naked woman, long a figure on which to project ideas and sensibilities about culture, and then a juxtaposition with language. So the Surrealists were also a poetic movement, and they were highly interested in language rather than purely representational imagery. I'm showing you two pictures now from the Egyptian strand of the Surrealists. On your left, you can see the poet Georges Hinaine. He was a key instigator in the emergence of the Art and Freedom Group, this Egyptian surrealist element. In the summer of 1935, he had begun correspondence with poet André Breton, and he was engaged in the question of how to fuse Marxism with surrealism as a revolutionary means of creation. He was also an activist, and he wanted to carry his message to the public. He gave radio addresses about surrealism in Cairo and Alexandria, and he inaugurated meetings with like-minded colleagues. As he outlined in a speech that he gave over the radio, he conceived of surrealism as something rooted in poetry, and he talked about the movement's origins in the 19th century with writers Rimbaud, Montremont, and Alfred Jarry. He mentioned Dada, and he talked about Freud. He quoted André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto, And he contrasted surrealism with other avant-garde movements of the time, like Cubism and Futurism. In Henein's opinion, unlike Futurism, which was merely an Italian commodity, he said, which was almost a propaganda movement for the Italian government, Surrealism had a transnational nature and was open. And even though it was headquartered in Paris, there were people taking it up in Belgrade, Brussels, Bucharest, Prague, London, and Tokyo, and of course now Cairo. In 1938, a group of writers, artists, and lawyers wrote a manifesto that they called Long Live Degenerate Art. And the leaders of this group conceived of their manifesto as part of this larger surrealist project against authoritarian governments. In the local context, their manifesto launched a polemic against Egyptian cultural discourse which emphasized elitism and academic painting. The group ended up mounting at least 5 art exhibitions of independent art, and they produced a number of short-lived periodicals. I'm showing you now the image on the center and on the right are 2 examples of this surrealistic production. On the left, you can see a famous painting by Mahmoud Said, a quite well-known Egyptian artist. And what's interesting here is that in the publications that the Egyptian surrealists produced, they were rewriting their own art history. So you see Mahmoud Said being claimed for their handbill of exhibitioners in their exhibition as a type of surrealist. Not that he considered himself one, but that his odd approach to depicting women, and the surrealists wrote about this blonde woman with the eagle eyes who seemed both masculine and feminine as an example where Mahmoud Said had actually exceeded the social mores of how to depict a woman, how to depict a person. So they claimed him as part of their program of producing a free art that exceeded these kinds of rules of society. Now let me return to the 2010 exhibition at the Townhouse Gallery. What I'm showing you here is one of the fragments from this production in the late 30s and early 40s that the artists, Oliver Schanarin and Adam Broomberg, recuperated. The phrase here, female workers of all lands be beautiful, is both imperative, a command of what people ought to do, and of course a sort of nonsense phrase that undercuts the idea of beauty and aesthetics. And it's taken from a line that Georges Hinaine had written in the text that he was producing for the group. When these artists visiting the Townhouse Gallery completed their research, they put together an exhibition that they titled Special Exhumation of the Egyptian Surrealist Movement. So this is one of the pieces. The invitation announced, brought to you by Adam Broomberg and Oliver Schanarin, and 60 years after the Surrealist movement occurred in Egypt, the 6th Art and Freedom Show is taking place at Townhouse. In other words, it was a continuation of a project that had just been put in sort of on hold for 60 years. In another promotional text they wrote, they explained that they were interested in the ephemerality of Egyptian surrealism, the way it could appear and go away. And they saw the group's activities in the late 30s as a moment when surrealism, as they said, quote, surrealism, in an odd alliance with Marxism, met the Orient, end quote. That brief moment, they said, was short and sweet. So how did the artists present this quality of shortness and sweetness? Well, they reprinted posters from the sayings of Georges Hinaine. So they went to a printing press still existing in Egypt, and they reprinted, using the mechanical means of production that were of great interest to the surrealists, these posters in bulk. And they're really incredible sayings, nonsense phrases that are extremely evocative and poetic. Then in the gallery space itself, they displayed those fragments in different ways. So you can see a table on which were piled the stacks of the posters that had been produced. you see that they hired a sign painter to write the introductory text on the wall as if it were sort of appearing over time in the slow pace of sign painting. So they were contrasting handwriting temporality and poster temporality. And then they also put these fragments that they had unearthed from their interviews with people on the ground about surrealism into the gallery space as well. And it became almost like a schoolroom setting, as if somebody was supposed to arrive there. It's very white, it's very clean, it's like these things are just sort of appearing in a dream, and one has to catch them and somehow consume them and put them back into one's consciousness. This particular text is from 1944. It's actually introducing a 1944 text that Hane wrote called The Prestige of Terror, which was a response to the Hiroshima bombings, and a discussion of how after such a bomb, terrorism takes on an entirely different meaning. These are some of the letterpress blocks that were used to produce the posters. And the artists also unearthed other types of media fragments about surrealism, including a film by one of the original members of the group, Darat al Funun, who after he had participated in the surrealism group, had left the visual arts for cinema and social realism. And he made in 1943 an important film called The Black Market, which had been censored beyond recognition. The artist located his nephew, got a VHS copy of the film, and they showed portions of it in the exhibition space as well. So the idea is that subsequent iterations of surrealism are also included in the exhibition. This is one of the most provocative of the sayings that the Surrealists had coined in the 30s, and it's a play with an idea by Trotsky that every man deserves to get his share of bread and his share of poetry. So this is truly trying to marry socialist commitment, communist commitment, and the idea of art and its place in that form of commitment. And then they took those posters they produced and they actually put them up in Cairo's streets. They didn't last very long there. I mean, if you are talking about bread and freedom in, 1 year ago in Egypt, that type of sentiment seems to be fairly threatening, or at least totally confusing. They were quickly taken down, but the artist documented the loss of the posters, and that became part of the piece as well. So in this segment where I'm introducing visiting artists to Cairo attempt to resurrect a type of history and bring surrealism back into the consciousness of the audience in that setting, I just want to say that the artists clearly felt that this was a step in an ongoing process. They invited, as I'm putting up the text here, people that they invited to the exhibition to contribute their memories and recollections of these artists. And at the end of their residency, they made an online archive, which they said they would keep adding to, and they invited other people to add to it as well. And this is the URL for that archive. It has some of the photographs I showed, and some references about Egyptian surrealism. So in other words, this art project was one part conceptual and aesthetic in terms of arranging material that the artists gathered, and in another part, it was generative. It created interest. In the Cairo art scene, this interest was translated as buzz. There were reviews of the exhibition which talked about the buzz about Egyptian surrealism that had been generated by the artists. Such to the point that this idea that Egyptian surrealism, which had always been present in textbooks, had nonetheless been silent. It had been entombed in these historical books without being alive in anybody's practice. But what do we make of this? Lying silently doesn't mean it wasn't there. As I said, surrealism is very present in all writings on Egyptian modern art. Any survey book that you open will talk about surrealism. It will name the artists that were involved. It will mention that they existed. In this case, we see visiting artists coming to arrive and survey a historical terrain, and they create a new view onto local art history, making it feel new again and making it consciously known. That's what these artists were invited to do, and they did it with great elegance. As an approach to art making, however, this is a complicated proposition because it updates a certain kind of social capital that comes with being surrealist, with calling oneself surrealist, and it redistributes that kind of social capital. So, with the goal of offering a critical review of the stakes involved in being surrealist, I'm going to highlight some details from the life cycle of surrealism as an international phenomenon. One point I want to emphasize is that from its inception, surrealism saw itself as a subversive art movement, but at the same time, it was a pop cultural phenomenon. So in this slide, I'm trying to show you on the far left, you see a caricature of the 1938 Surrealist exposition held in France. So that already for kind of mass and popular consumption, surrealism becomes a collection of images and tropes that are somehow against the norm, but also wacky and fun and appealing. On the far right, you see some paintings actually included in that 1938 exhibition. And in the center, you see the classic photograph of Diego Rivera, Leon Trotsky, and André Breton, the great surrealist poet, meeting in Mexico in July 1938 and writing together a tract called For an Independent Revolutionary Art, which wanted to reclaim communism for a much more creative mindset that would exist outside authoritarian rule and with art at the center of it. Now, in the history of modern Arab artists and their thinking and practice, I would like to point out that surrealism, as a phenomenon in both senses, has in fact been present from basically the same time. So in the archival research I've been doing in Syria, last year I found this 1933 article in the magazine Al-Thaqafa, 1933, which reports that in Istanbul there was a major art exhibition that included nudes and surrealist painting. And that the fact that it included these elements in its exhibition showed that the modernization reforms that, it doesn't mention Ataturk, but obviously that had been instituted in Turkey had been successful, that there was a happy audience consuming surrealism and being very appreciative of the new style of paintings. So the article says, the press has welcomed this modern artistic creativity, with the newspaper Turkiya dedicating a weekly supplement to the new painters. In other words, to develop a taste for surrealism, or at least to understand it and its presence in modern history, was a barometer of modern social development. If you were developed, you could understand or accept surrealism. Just quickly, it's always helpful to see what's going on at the same time. We all know Salvador Dali, but let me remind you this painting was completed in 1931, so it would have been among the new styles of painting that the artists in Istanbul were responding to and producing in their own way in the capital of Turkey. Just a few years later, we get works that are a bit more transgressive and experimental, so not even using the traditional pictorial language of very realistic painting as we see here. So here you have a very realistic style and an unrealistic subject matter coming from dreams. Then surrealism expands to include new techniques like ink transfers and painting onto glass and rubbings and ways of moving imagery from one surface to another. And of course, the piece that made me, when I was like 14 years old, want to be an artist, which is Merritt Oppenheim's incredible fur-lined cup, made in 1936 by a woman artist. When World War II broke out, many of the artists that had been sort of centralized in Paris ended up moving, and surrealism went into an odd kind of diaspora. We have Yves Tanguy on your left, who ended up going to the US, with Fredo Lam, who's a Cubist painter, but who trained in Spain and was living in Paris, had returned to Cuba. And so there's this great movement of the automatic writing techniques and the idea of sort of keeping a line moving continuously, moving out away from Europe and into other settings for display. early Jackson Pollock, and there are reports we know that he was engaging in automatic writing games. So you don't necessarily have recognizable surrealist images, but you have this technique of trying to get away from rational depiction and into a kind of more automatic painterly expression. You can see that Jackson Pollock from there goes on to his more recognized style. And then I just wanted to point out that by 1965, and here I don't know if you can read it very well, there's an incredible Egyptian artist, her name is Ghazbia Siri, and in 1965, the Minister of Culture in Egypt received, on behalf of Ghazbia Siri, an invitation from the Sao Paulo Biennale to submit paintings to a special Surrealism and Fantastic Art exhibition that was being planned for this international Biennale. So here we have a movement by Surrealism as a category from a kind of individual practice to a solid category for display in the 1960s. The letter indicates that the special section will, quote, arise cultural and didactic interest. The idea is that it has become a kind of draw, it's a kind of commodity. Just quickly, for the case of Syria, which is my specialty, if after World War II and before, say, the 1970s, this notion of surrealism and fantastic art become a kind of special hall in the greater exposition of international art trends, like we saw in this biennial instance, then I want to point out that Syrians were in the surrealist hall the entire time, from the end of World War II and the securing of national independence until now. So I'm highlighting a figure who's quite interesting. His name is Robert Malky. He was a critic and an artist. He was born in Alexandria, but mostly lived in Damascus. And in 1949, he showed a series of paintings he called Cubo-Surrealistic. You can see them on the bottom, one of them in the bottom left-hand corner. I haven't documented any others. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you an issue from 1957 of Middle East Forum, which I'm sure is some American propaganda magazine, although I haven't located it. Robert Malky was also a lawyer, and he wrote art criticism for Middle East Forum, in which he introduced himself as one of Syria's lone modern artists, whose efforts in the surrealistic area had encouraged other Syrian artists against great odds to dare to experiment. And he credited himself with rising interest to the level necessary for the state to allot a special hall to modern tendencies, including surrealism, in 1956. So I'm just giving one example of a way that surrealism can be consolidated in a kind of bureaucratic way to prove the standing of particular artists in an art scene. Basically, simultaneously, there's an incredible poet and theorist named Orhan Meiser and his brother Adnan, who are from Aleppo. And Orhan, in 1947, published a book of criticism and poems actually called Surreal. It was published in Aleppo, and it had an electrifying effect on the poetry scene local to Syria. So I don't know the dates of these surrealistic drawings that I'm showing you, but they're by the brother Adnan. And it seems as if in the kind of poetry salons that this group held, Adnan probably sort of almost performed surrealism as a way to illustrate the ideas of free verse and free creation that Orhan was advocating in his criticism and in this book that he had published. On the bottom, I have a clip, and you probably can't read it well. I'll share the article with anyone who's curious. In 1952, in a newspaper called El Benet, Orhan Meiser published an article, and the whole issue was devoted to the issue of art and how to understand it in Syria. El Benet was an organ of the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, which has incredible ideas about creativity and its appropriateness to a setting. And in this case, Meiser said, dividing art into schools is foreign to art. So he struck out against the idea that the game of playing, whether somebody's surrealist or not, is at all useful or appropriate to actual creativity. Fateh al-Mudaris, who's one of the most well-known and influential of the painters in Syria. He was born in 1922 and died in 1999, and was an incredible thinker and presence in the cultural scene in Damascus. On the right, you can see a pretty familiar Mudaris style, which marries a kind of earthy surface of like sand and clay to childlike imagery and an arrangement of elements on the canvas that's very tightly composed, as if the figures are icons or from tomb imagery. But on the left, you see his early surrealistic stage. He was showing these types of paintings as early as 1948 in a group show of young artists at the Damascus Tajhiz, which was the preparatory school for promising youth in Damascus. He was also publishing poetry that he described as symbolist. It talked about snakes, spider webs, things like this. There's a trove of beautiful surrealistic sketches, as well as uglier and more directly angry imagery, all of which date to the 1950s. So I'm showing you 3 sketches that are in the collection of his family that are playing with different types of surrealism. So you have the inkblot image, which is clearly an imaging of the unconscious. You have also a kind of more carefully rendered, on the bottom, surrealistic imagery of a setting that could be under the sea or could be the desert. And then on the right, a very quick watercolor sketching that it seems as if the artist went back in and added the faces and made the figures. So this idea of starting just directly from material and then converting the dream into language and saying what it is present in Fateh. In 1955, he put this in the annual salon, and the National Museum bought it. They had no problem with surrealistic imagery, and they bought it for 25 lira. Oh, I'm sorry, 50 lira, according to their records. Fateh went on a fellowship to Rome in the mid-50s, and upon his return to Damascus, he had been in Aleppo. He returned to Damascus to teach at the Art Academy. He wasn't working in such a literal surrealistic style, but he kept up the automatist methods. So I'm showing you on the right 2 pages from a poetry diwan that he published in 1962, along with Sharif Taznagar. At the time, sort of automatic writing exercises that the 2 engaged in together, where they would write lines of poetry and illustrations without editing themselves, and reproduced it as a book without editing. On the left, just I think a lovely painting by Fateh from a similar period, again with this idea of scratching without editing. And this continues into the more recognizable period in Fateh al-Mudaris' career, the sort of ink wash, where he then goes in and converts the ink to figures as if the dream is coming into focus. You can see over time. So in the bottom right, I've put the 1953 inkblot sketch. Above it is a page from a 1962 Shar magazine issue, 64, where Fateh had contributed poetry and his own illustrations. On the, to its left, on the green paper, it's from the 70s, and then on the far left is a Thawra newspaper in Syria in 1976, Fateh's illustrations to poetry again, just the straight ink into figures. And just to finish with the Fateh segment, on the right is a late drawing, it's incredible, by Fateh in the 90s, which has a kind of scary, ghoulish figure with a mouth that's been composed from a cigarette butt. And to me, it's probably about the health risks of smoking and this idea of what's not allowed, because you have la la hua hua, which is like commanding this figure to come into consciousness and stop doing what's wrong. It's all this kind of protean imagery. And on the left, a sketch from the early 50s, which has some formal resonances for me, because you have the inkblot in the center creating the mouth, and this question of what is allowed and what is not allowed, what would be modern and what would not be just to point out, before I go on to sort of finish with Egyptian surrealism and what happened to it historically, I wanted to say that, of course, in the contemporary moment, surrealism remains a highly useful strategy. It allows an artist to juxtapose objectivity and subjectivity and to question the conditions of history itself. So in this piece, Archipelago, a World Map by Hamdi Attia, who's a contemporary Egyptian artist, and which is presently installed here at the Darat. If you haven't seen it, you can just go up that way and see it. The artist has used, in a certain sense, the technique of psychogeography, which is a strategy adopted by the inheritors of surrealism in France, where one navigates one space using the map of another space. So in this case, we have a map of the Palestinian territories, but they've been sort of set apart from each other and placed into the shape of another map, so that the land mass, in a way, starts to resemble a kind of Pangea original territory and begins to convey this idea that nobody can quite own, no matter what map-making technologies and rational ways of understanding space are available, nobody can quite know or own or inhabit that space. We also have the Lebanese artist Walid Rad, one of the best-known artists working today from the Arab region, who has most recently begun a series of works that are a history of art in the Arab world, basically examining how difficult it is to know the history of art in the Arab world. The piece is pretty complicated, and I'm not going to try to talk about it now, although I'm happy to try to talk about it later. But in this case, the slide I'm showing you, the artist has gathered exhibition covers and shrunken the text and enlarged the color field as a comment on the distance of objective facts from any kind of experience in the gallery where colors leap forward. One component of that piece is a list of artists, Lebanese artists working in the 20th century. Now you can't probably see it on the slide very well, but the names of the artists are written in white press type, and they're put up onto the wall, so they're extremely hard to see. And the explanation given for this piece is that the names of the artists of these Lebanese artists that were working before Walid Rad, came to Walid Rad, the artist, in a kind of dream setting. So that's why they're white. They're not fully present, they're just in the mind. What the artist then did was leave some mistakes in the names, so that names are not spelled correctly, or they're not fully present in the gallery. And then he waited for those who knew about the history of modern Lebanese art to correct him. When the correction was announced or made known to the artist corrected it with red ink. I think I'm saying this right. Perhaps the person who noticed the mistake corrected it in red ink. So here you see the name of an artist, Johnny Tahan, who's a Lebanese artist. His name is misspelled. The shadda is correctly added here, and the name is placed on the wall. And then it's buttressed or supported by Walid Rad's historical research into the career of Johnny Tahan. Johnny Tahan, it turns out, was a surrealist artist working in Lebanon in the 1980s. So all of the documentation that you see the artist has produced and put up in the gallery space document the career of an artist, little known, little remembered, working in a surrealist manner. In this particular extremely complicated work by Walid Rad, what is interesting to me for the purposes of my talk is not the complexities of the piece. It's rather this idea that in the work it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that the surrealist artist, the surrealist one, is the one who is forgotten. In other words, if the title of my talk was Surrealism Without Surrealists, here The work presents a kind of surrealism without surrealists that are worth remembering. So just to finish the talk for this evening, given the growing dissatisfaction with the slim histories of avant-garde movements that have been circulating, a dissatisfaction that I think Rod's piece highlights, and the first piece I showed you by the artists working at the Townhouse Gallery tries to remedy, let us quickly talk about the actual path that Egyptian surrealism followed after the Art and Freedom Group dissolved. Here I'm showing you a 1950 issue of a magazine called The New Woman that was published in Cairo that includes an article by Georges Hennain that talks about folk practices and magic. I'm showing that because from its beginnings in Egypt, the Art and Freedom Group had to defend itself and their practices against the accusation that surrealism was, quote, purely a French movement, end quote, with no relevance to Egypt. This is the issue that I hope we might discuss later in the Q&A as well. It's an interesting critique. Does it have to have a relevance to Egypt? The actual members of the group responded by saying, well, surrealism is international. And then they also said, and this is more interesting, that surrealist imagination was in fact already found in folk arts and Egyptian antiquities. In other words, that the history of Egyptian art was already always surrealist. He wrote, have you not seen the Maulid sugar dolls with their four hands? And here you can see a sort of popular rendition of the sugar dolls that were in the Maulid folk celebrations in Egypt. Have you not seen our puppets? Have you not listened to the stories of Shur and Clever Hassan and others from popular folklore? These are examples of surrealism. So are pharaonic sculptures, and so are pieces in the Coptic Museum. In other words, this line of argumentation that surrealism was already Egyptian can be seen as a threshold to the next stage of artists' use of the irrational and magical symbols. In the 50s and 60s, the folk arts and their Egyptian quality became a major theme in Egyptian painting. They were something represented. They weren't embodied, but they were shown. Here I'm showing you a portrait of Jamal as-Sagini, who's actually a sculptor in Egypt, where he's ringed by these sugar dolls with their multiple arms, and an actual image of a man selling the sugar dolls. There was then actually founded in the mid-1940s a group that called itself the Contemporary Art Group, and they inherited that relationship between folk practice and surrealism. The most famous of its practitioners is Abdul Hadi al-Ghazar. He was born in 1925 and raised in the neighborhood of Sayyid Zainab in Alexandria, which was known at that time for a neighborhood as being filled with mysticism and cultic practices, including fortune-telling and collective exorcism. And you can see imagery from that setting, that kind of folk magic setting in his paintings. He repeats motifs like the spider's web, the snake, the lizard, the bull, the key, the horse, and the shell. Both magical and sad, his paintings and drawings have been described as a negation of Gauguin's luscious Pacific paradise. He also engaged in free writing practices. I'm showing some of the poetry. So this idea of writing simultaneously with creating imagery remains strong in surrealism. By 1954, the achievements of the group were well chronicled. Amy Azar, a Lebanese professor who was working at Ain Shams University teaching literature and literary criticism, published a book called The Awakening of Pictorial Consciousness in Egypt, and it introduced the Contemporary Art Group as the first rebellious modern artists in Egypt. The cover of his book is a drawing by Azar. I also want to point out that Azar offered a reading of Azar's paintings that made them into national allegories. What I mean by that is he said that the artist's non-representational approach, this fixation on symbols and snakes and magic, should be understood as actually the most realist as showing what actually existed because it captured the tension of Egypt's position in its development, trapped between the burden of the land's history and expectations for its future. In other words, this retreat to magic and the unconscious is made into the realm of the underdeveloped for those who are not yet modern. This interest in the folk arts becomes part of the curricula at the Fine Arts College. You have a picture painted by Gazar of the art critic Amy Azar, and you can see that same painting in the picture of students on the left, which is, as the caption explains, a group of young students who are within the group of contemporary art in 1956. And you can see their paintings displayed behind them. Here we have a great Syrian painter, Nazir Naba, in his early magical realist stage. He studied in Egypt, so I would suggest in a larger version of this paper that these ideas migrate back into the Syrian context, but for now I just want to show the images. In that one you can notice the interest in the shell, which helps us to relate it to the contemporary art group and Al-Ghazar's imagery of the shells. And my second to last slide, artist Layla Nazir, who also studied in Egypt, and her masterpiece painting, in my opinion, from 1968, which depicts Vietnam, not in any direct sense, but as a kind of magical realist setting that's been totally infused with a sense of tragedy and sadness. I think it's a great painting. With juxtapositions of imagery and scale, notice the giant mouth that might also be a shark or a magical charm, all in the same picture plane. And so, as a way to conclude, the great novelist and critic Abdul Rahman Munif has suggested in a great article about Jawad Salim, has suggested that the manifesto Long Live Degenerate Art, written by the Surrealists in Egypt, was, quote, more a polemical response to European fascism than an answer to any local need, end quote. As I hope my presentation has shown, I'm not sure I entirely agree with this type of assessment. Part of the purpose of this talk was to suggest places and artworks where a desire to meet a local need was not actually the foremost concern. I think the question of the case of surrealists in Egypt and their resurrection at different points in history, including just most recently in 2010, is this question. It raises this question. How do we actually understand a local need? Is there such a thing? And how can it be evaluated? And how can it be met by artists? My talk title refers to the policy of communism without communists, which had been in place in Egypt in the 1950s. At the time when the contemporary art group, the inheritors of the preceding art and freedom group, were entering history books and were offering surreal imagery as if it were realism exactly about Egypt. So in that context, the surrealists became nationalists with the rise of managed national development. This is in the history writing. It's not in what I'm claiming the boundaries for the artists actually work, but this is the way that it's been remembered. And I think it can be more open than that. At the moments when artists chose surrealism, that choice to me seems to have a lot to do with choosing not to make sense at a local level in the way that the local level had been prescribed by conditions there. Surrealism expresses a concern with the collective unconscious as something structured, something from which new texts may be constituted, read, altered, pasted up, taken down. And it's an open heritage worth keeping open